The dog showed up on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were the days I checked the eastern snares. I'd been running the preserve for 11 months by then, not running it the way the Hartwell Conservation Trust had intended. With clipboards and radio collars and quarterly reports filed to an office that no longer existed. Running it the way you run anything in the endemic. Quietly, systematically, without expecting anyone to notice or care. The preserve was 400 acres of managed wetland in the Carolina Lowcountry, hemmed in on 3 sides by marsh, and on the 4th by a gravel access road that the county had stopped maintaining 8 months ago. The nearest town was Elmore, 14 miles east, population unknown, and probably not worth knowing. My name is Dale Pruitt. I was 43 years old when all of this happened. And I want to be specific about that because the story I'm about to tell you is the kind that gets better in memories softened, cleaned up, made to mean something clean and transferable. I don't want to do that to it. I was 43. I was a veterinary technician by trade, a person who had spent 20 years being useful in rooms where the patient couldn't explain where it hurt. I was not a soldier. I was not a prepper. I was not the kind of man people looked to when things went wrong. I was, however, the kind of man who noticed things. Animals had taught me that. You spend enough time watching creatures that can't lie to you. You get a feel for behavioral deviation. You start reading the space around living things rather than the living things themselves. That's why I noticed the dog before it reached the tree line. It was moving wrong. Not injured, I ruled that out by the 3rd stride. It was moving with the specific urgency of an animal that knows where it's going and is trying to get someone else to follow. Head low, gait short, constant glance backward toward the marsh trail. A mixed breed, maybe 60 pounds, with a brindle coat that had gone rough at the shoulders from weeks without grooming. No collar, no tags. But its eyes were sharp and deliberate in a way that feral animals rarely sustain. I'd seen it twice before, at the perimeter. Both times it had disappeared before I could get a fix on its range. I'd noted it in my log with the same shorthand I used for everything. Unknown canine, origin uncertain, behavior non-aggressive. That's all. A data point. Now it was standing at the edge of my gravel lot, 20 meters from the tracking station's side entrance, looking directly at me. I had a snare bag over one shoulder and a hatchet on my hip, and I was already running behind schedule because the eastern trap line had turned up a dead nutria, and I'd had to reset the snare with cord I didn't have to spare. I looked at the dog. The dog looked at me. It turned toward the marsh trail, walked 5 steps, and stopped, turned around again. I don't have time for this, I said out loud. It didn't matter, obviously. Language means exactly nothing to a dog that has decided it needs you to walk somewhere. I know that. I've known that since I was 22 and sedating my first wolf hybrid in a clinic outside of Raleigh. But I stood there, for a long moment anyway. Long enough that the marsh birds behind me went quiet and then resumed, which meant nothing in particular was wrong in that direction. Long enough to feel slightly ridiculous. Long enough to think about the fact that I hadn't spoken to another person in 16 days, and that my voice sounded unfamiliar to me, and that I had just held a conversation with a stray dog and lost. I followed it. The trail into the marsh was a raised board path the Trust had installed for guided tours, and it had held up better than most things built by the Trust because it was simple and low to the ground, and the cypress knees on either side of it had no interest in tourism. 300 meters in, the boards ended and the trail became compressed reed mat over soft ground. I knew this section. I checked it weekly for infected drift. They wandered into wet terrain more often than people assumed, drawn by water or sound. And they didn't navigate it well, but they didn't always need to. The dog moved fast here, sure-footed in the soft ground in a way that told me it had made this particular path many times. We went 600 meters into the marsh before it stopped. It stopped at a specific point, not a clearing, not a landmark I recognized. Just a bend where the reed mat widened slightly, and a stand of dead cypress rose out of standing water like stripped bone. The dog sat, looked at me, looked at the cypress, looked back at me. There was nothing there. No structure, no cache, no body, no sound. Just standing water reflecting a flat February sky, and a dog sitting in the mud watching me fail to understand something it considered obvious. I stood there for 2 full minutes. Nothing resolved. The dog waited with the patience of something that had stopped being surprised by human slowness. Eventually, I turned around and walked back to the station. The dog didn't follow. I noted it in the log that evening. Unknown canine led me to GPS point 32.4417 degrees north, 80.5239 degrees west. Nothing observed. Behavior, purposeful. Duration, approximately 9 minutes on site. Will monitor. Monitoring, in practice, meant trying not to think about it. I had a routine that I kept because routine was the architecture that kept the endemic from collapsing inward on you. 5:30 wake. Water check on the 2 rain catchment barrels at the north end of the station. Generator fuel assessment. I ran it for 2 hours in the morning only, enough to charge the radio battery and keep the chest freezer cold. Breakfast from stores. Perimeter walk, east circuit. Snare check. Midday inventory. Afternoon perimeter walk, west circuit. Evening log. Sleep by 9. The routine had kept me functional for 11 months. It had also kept me from thinking too carefully about the fact that I was alone, that I had chosen to be alone, and that I had stopped looking for reasons to change that. The preserve had been a research station before the endemic, as a modest operation. 3 permanent staff and rotating graduate students from a coastal ecology program in Beaufort. When the outbreak moved inland and the university evacuated its personnel, the station had been left with its equipment, its stores, and a laminated emergency protocol card that had clearly been written by someone who did not anticipate a scenario where civilization stopped being the backup plan. I had arrived here 7 months into the endemic, after leaving a situation in Walterboro that I'm not going to describe in detail, except to say that it involved a group of 11 people, a disagreement about what to do with someone who had been bitten, and a decision I made at 2 a.m. that 6 people were angry about and 5 people were alive because of. I drove west on 17A with everything I owned in the back of a borrowed pickup. Turned onto the preserve access road on instinct. I had done fieldwork here for 3 weeks, years ago, and found the station unlocked and empty. I had stayed because the station was defensible by virtue of geography rather than fortification. Marsh on 3 sides. A single access road I could monitor. No reason for anyone to come. And because, if I'm being honest, I was exhausted by the specific weight of being around people who needed me to keep making decisions. The dog complicated that. Not immediately, not obviously. But when I woke Wednesday morning and found it sitting outside the station's east-facing window, not scratching, not whining, just sitting, I felt the first edge of something that I'd spent 11 months learning to smooth away. It felt like obligation, or the precursor to it. The low warning hum of being needed by something you hadn't agreed to be responsible for. I opened the window. The dog didn't move. I looked at it, and it looked at me with that steady, patient attention that certain animals maintain and that most people mistake for blankness. It wasn't blank. It was concentrated. "You're not mine," I said. It blinked. I gave it half a protein bar through the window gap. I'm not able to explain why, except that I'd fed injured animals through wire gaps for 20 years. And the gesture was so automatic, it bypassed the part of my brain where principled decisions lived. The dog ate the protein bar in 2 bites, which told me it was very hungry and had very good manners, which is a specific and somewhat heartbreaking combination in a stray. That afternoon, it led me to the same point in the marsh. I hadn't intended to follow. I was on my West Circuit perimeter walk, moving along the tree line toward the access road, when it appeared at my left flank, moving in the opposite direction. Not frantic, not dramatic, just present and purposeful, and very clearly going somewhere specific. I stopped walking west. It stopped walking east. We looked at each other across 12 feet of dead grass. "Show me," I said. The same GPS point, the same dead cypress, the same standing water. 18 minutes on sight this time, because I moved more carefully, crouched, looked at the water's surface, checked the cypress base for marks, circled the area in a slow radius. A pair of wood ducks startled off the water to my left and came back within 4 minutes, which meant there was nothing large enough to alarm them within 100 meters. Still nothing. On the way back, moving through the reed mat with the dog beside me, I heard them for the first time. 2 infected, maybe 3, somewhere northeast in the wetland. The sound was unmistakable. After 11 months, that specific arrhythmic movement through terrain they couldn't read. That stumbling persistence that had no regard for mud depth or branch density. They weren't close. 200 meters, maybe more. I stopped. The dog stopped with me. Here is what I noticed. The dog did not look toward the sound. It looked at me, watched my face for my reaction with the specific attention of an animal that has decided a human's response is more relevant than its own instincts. That, more than anything else that happened in those first days, is what made me keep following it. By the end of the first week, I'd been to that point in the marsh 4 times. The 5th time, I brought the good flashlight. I want to be clear that I am not a mystical person. I don't look for signs. I am the kind of man who, when presented with a compelling anecdote, will ask for the sample size. I spent 20 years in veterinary medicine, which is a field that strips the sentiment out of you and replaces it with methodology. Because if you follow your feelings instead of the symptoms, you make mistakes, and the patient pays for them. So when I say that I started to feel that something was at that point in the marsh, I want to qualify that immediately by saying that what I mean is that something was there that I was unable to perceive with the tools I'd brought so far, and that the rational response to that was to bring better tools. Hence the good flashlight. The dog led. I followed. 1,800 hours, the marsh going blue-gray in the winter dusk, the reed beds hissing in a wind that came off the water in short, cold bursts. I moved slowly and watched the ground with the same attention I gave to snare lines, looking for indication, compressed reed, drag marks, anything that might explain what the dog was responding to. I found it on my 3rd pass of the site. It was so close to the waterline that I'd missed it twice in daylight. A section of reed mat that had been folded back and then replaced carefully, but not carefully enough. Underneath, a shallow depression in the soft ground, perhaps 40 centimeters across, shaped by repeated pressure. Not animal. The edges were wrong for animal. Too deliberate, too consistent in their radius. A person had been lying here, multiple times recently. I stood up and turned the flashlight off and stood in the almost dark and let that settle. Someone was using this location. They were coming to it at intervals, lying in the reed bed, staying low, staying still, which meant they were hiding from something, or hiding from someone, or watching something they didn't want to be seen watching. The dog sat beside me in the dark and leaned against my left leg, which it had not done before. A small physical weight. I put my hand on its back without deciding to. I walked back to the station and spent 2 hours re-evaluating everything I thought I knew about the preserve's perimeter. The thing about living alone for months is that it compresses your perception of risk. You begin to assess threat relative to your own parameters. You know your perimeter, you know your circuits, you know the sounds and the silences. And eventually you mistake familiarity for safety. I had been monitoring my territory. I had not been monitoring the territory around my territory, because my territory was all that mattered to me. Someone else was out there, in the marsh, and they had been there long enough to establish a pattern. I reset my sleep schedule that night and lay awake until 2, running through what I knew about the preserve's geography. The access road to the north was my choke point. I checked it every morning, and it was the only route that would bring a vehicle in. But the preserve shared its eastern boundary with a wildlife corridor that connected to a larger land trust another 6 miles east. On foot, through wetland terrain, someone could approach from that direction without touching the access road. In the morning, I walked the eastern boundary for the first time in 6 weeks. The dog came with me, which I'd stopped trying to prevent. It stayed at my left flank, with a discipline that wasn't trained. It was just its nature, apparently, to keep pace and stay close without crowding. I found the entry point in less than an hour. A section of the old wire boundary fence that had been worked loose from 2 posts, bent back in a way that left no visible gap from the outside but could be folded open from the marsh side. Clean work, patient work. Someone was accessing the preserve through the wetland and resting at that specific point in the marsh. The question I spent the rest of that day not answering was whether that should change anything about how I lived. The dog's name, the one I gave it in my head, which is different from the name I eventually gave it out loud, was nothing. Not as a statement, not as a judgment, as a placeholder. The way you put a dash in a form field you intend to come back to and then keep forgetting. The dog was nothing yet. Nothing had been decided about the dog. Nothing could be assumed. I kept calling it dog in the log entries, which felt appropriately provisional. 12 days after the first incident, I stayed at the marsh location. I'd brought a sleeping pad, my good rain layer, the hatchet, and 2 protein bars. I arrived at the site at 1500 hours and settled into a position 10 meters northwest of the depression, behind a dense stand of marsh elder that gave me a sight line to the reed bed and access to the board path behind me if I needed to move fast. The dog settled beside me without instruction. It put its chin on its front paws and became very still. The specific stillness of an animal that has hunted and knows that presence is not the same as motion. We waited. The marsh did what marshes do. Water moved. Birds transited overhead in the early dark hour before dusk. An aninga worked the shallows 30 meters south with its pterodactyl patience. The infected sounds I'd been tracking northeast had shifted closer today, though still not a threat at this range. 2 individuals, I'd estimated, based on the audio signature. They'd been in the same general quadrant for 3 days, which suggested they were caught in a circuit rather than actively tracking anything. At 1720, the dog's head came up, not toward the northeast and the infected sounds, toward the southeast, toward the boundary fence entry point. I stayed still, kept my breathing even. Watched. She came through the reed bed on a line so direct it was almost mechanical, like she'd walked it so many times the path had worn itself into her memory, and she could run it in the dark. Mid-30s, maybe. Hard to assess precisely because she was wearing a marsh camo poncho that had been hand-modified with actual reed bundles stitched into the fabric. Practical and brilliant, and clearly the work of someone who understood concealment at a level above the improvised. She was carrying a compound bow, unstrung, across her back, a machete on her right hip, a pack that rode high and tight. She moved with the low center of gravity walk of someone who had learned to move through wetland without disturbing the surface. And she didn't make the amateur's mistake of looking down. She kept her eye line up and used her feet to read the ground. She was almost at the depression before she registered me. She didn't scream. She didn't raise the machete. She dropped into a crouch and went absolutely still. And I recognized that response because it's not a fight response or a flight response, it's a read response. She was gathering information before she decided anything. "I'm not going to move," I said quietly. The dog stood up. And this is the part I have thought about many times since. It didn't move toward her defensively. It moved toward her the way it moved toward the marsh trail when it wanted me to follow. Direct, unambiguous, no hesitation. It walked to her and sat down at her feet. She stared at the dog. She stared at me. "It's your dog," she said. First words she'd spoken. Flat affect, accented in a way I couldn't immediately place. Not Southern, something mid-Atlantic scraped down to its consonants by months of being used sparingly. "No," I said. "I was hoping it was yours." She looked at the dog for a long time. The dog looked back at her with those steady, deliberate eyes. "It's not mine either," she said. She stood up slowly and didn't reach for the machete, and I didn't reach for the hatchet, and that mutual restraint felt like the beginning of something, though I couldn't have said what. Her name was Vera Stanek. She'd been in the preserve's eastern wetland corridor for 3 weeks, running a solo route that connected 2 waypoint caches she'd established when she was traveling with a group, and that she now maintained alone. She told me this in the precise, economical way of someone who has learned to give only the information necessary to determine if a person is safe, and to give it in an order that allows you to stop disclosing the moment the other person gives you a reason to. She didn't ask me many questions. She asked me one. "How long have you had that dog following you?" 2 weeks, I said. "It started leading me here." She looked at the depression in the reed bed, at the place where she had lain, hidden, on at least a dozen separate visits. "It led me here too," she said quietly. "The first time." She didn't come to the station that first night. She said she would, and she meant it. I believe that now, though at the time I wasn't sure. But she had a protocol she maintained about changing her sleep position. And she didn't break protocols. She told me that in the same flat tone she used for everything. And I understood it immediately because I maintained my own protocols for the same reason. Protocols were the thing you held on to when judgment got unreliable. She came the following morning, 7:15 before my perimeter walk, which told me she had been watching the station long enough to know my schedule. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. And then I decided that if I'd wanted to not be watched, I should have been less predictable. And that feeling unsettled by someone else's operational competence was a failure of my own reasoning. I made coffee, real coffee, a small strategic reserve I used for significant occasions, which told me something about how I was processing her arrival. And we sat on opposite sides of the station's main work table and began the careful work of establishing the baseline of each other. Vera had been a search and rescue coordinator for the State Forestry Service before the endemic. She knew wetland terrain the way I knew animal behavior, not by studying it, but by having navigated it under pressure for years, until the knowledge lived in her body and didn't require conscious retrieval. She had been traveling with a group of 7 when the endemic reached its current depth. And she had ended up alone through a series of events she described in a single sentence. 3 died, 2 left. I left the last 2 because one of them was going to get the other one killed. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. That single sentence contained enough information about her moral threshold to be useful. She studied the station with the methodical attention of someone completing an assessment. Not threatening, she wasn't casing it. She was learning its weaknesses, which was the same thing a person does when they're deciding whether to trust somewhere with their life. "You've been here 11 months, she said. It wasn't a question. 11 months and change. You're alone? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The infected cluster northeast has been tracking the same circuit for 4 days. That's not drift behavior. Something's anchoring them. I knew she was right. I'd noted the same thing and hadn't known what to do with it. Water source, maybe. There's a slough up there that holds standing water through the dry months. Maybe. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, which was my second-to-last ceramic mug. I'd given her the better one without thinking about it, which I didn't notice until she was already using it. Or something's been making noise at regular intervals, drawing them to a circuit. The generator. I ran it on a fixed schedule. Sound carries differently over water and wetland than over land, and I had never fully mapped my generator's acoustic reach. I looked at the wall where the generator schedule was pinned and felt the specific cold of a mistake you've been making for months without realizing it. "The generator," I said. She nodded, didn't say anything else. Gave me the space to finish the thought, which is the sign of someone who knows that conclusions land differently when you reach them yourself. I spent the afternoon redesigning the generator protocols, shorter cycles, irregular timing, no fixed pattern. Vera walked the station perimeter without being asked and marked 2 places on my perimeter map where she said the sight lines were wrong. She was right about both. We worked with the coordinated efficiency of people who are used to working alone and have developed sufficient self-awareness to apply that independence toward a shared problem without competing for it. The dog spent the day moving between us. This was new behavior when I had been alone. It stayed at a distance, watching. Now it seemed to regard us as a unit that required management. By dusk, I'd made a decision without fully articulating it. Vera was going to stay. Not because I'd reasoned my way to it, but because the station worked better with 2 people in it. And because I'd spent 11 months making every decision for myself, and none of them had led me anywhere in particular. And because a dog that navigated a wetland with better judgment than either of us seemed to think this was correct. She made the same decision without saying it either. She brought her pack inside and set it against the west wall. And we didn't discuss it. And that silence was its own kind of agreement. The dog led us back to the marsh point the next morning. Both of us, this time. Vera had been told about the previous trips. I'd shown her the log entries. She'd read them with the careful attention she brought to everything, leaning slightly forward, reading once quickly for content and once slowly for implication. When she finished, she set the log down and said, "It hasn't done anything useful there yet." "No," I said, "but it keeps going back. Every time." She thought about this for a moment. Animals revisit locations for specific reasons: scent, food, shelter, social memory. Yes. What's it not finding there that it keeps looking for? That was a better question than anything I'd asked myself in 2 weeks of following the dog. I didn't have an answer, and I told her so. And she accepted that without filling the silence. When the dog appeared at the station door at 6:40 and turned toward the marsh trail, we both went. Vera moved faster through the reed bed than I did, less hesitation about surface quality, which came from rescue work in terrain where stopping to consider was frequently worse than moving decisively. The dog adjusted its pace to mine, which I noticed. At the sight, Vera did what I should have done in the first week. She went into the standing water, not deep just to her knees, moving along the cypress base in slow lateral steps, feeling with her feet through the murk. I watched from the reed bed and tracked our surroundings. 2 minutes. 4. The wood ducks transited overhead, indifferent. She stopped, looked down, looked at me. "There's something solid under here," she said. "Not root structure. Too regular." We cleared it with our hands over the next 30 minutes, working carefully through black organic sediment and fibrous root mat. What we found was a section of corrugated aluminum, roughly 1.5 meters square, submerged to a depth of about 40 centimeters. Wedged between 2 cypress root masses in a way that could have been accidental or could have been very deliberately placed. Under the aluminum was a sealed waterproof case, the type used for camera equipment or sensitive instrumentation. A heavy-duty latching system, foam interior, still sealed and still intact. Inside the case, packed in foam cutouts that had been precision-fitted, a hand-crank satellite communicator. A Type 1 recognized the Forestry Service had used an older version of the same manufacturer. And beside it, in its own foam recess, a folded handwritten note that had been sealed inside 2 layers of Ziploc bags. The note read, in handwriting that had been made deliberately clear and even, "If you found the radio, you know what to do with it. If you don't, ask someone who does. The frequency is marked. There are people who can hear you." P. Below that, a frequency. Below the frequency, a date 3 months ago. Vera took the note, read it twice, put it down on the aluminum and stared at it in the way she had of being very still while thinking very fast. I looked at the dog. The dog looked at me. "P," Vera said. "Someone hid this here, wanted it found. Wanted it found by the right person. That's why it was buried." I thought about the depression in the reed bed, about someone lying there, patient and still, watching. "They were monitoring this location," I said, "checking if anyone came. And when the right person came." She stopped. "The dog," I said. We both looked at the dog. The dog was looking northeast, in the direction of the infected cluster, with the calm, focused attention of something managing 2 problems simultaneously. We didn't use the radio that day. Vera needed to think, and I understood that, because I needed to think too. And neither of us were the kind of people who act on information before they've turned it over enough times to find the edge that cuts. We carried the case back to the station and set it on the work table, and spent the evening separately arriving at the same set of questions. Who was P? How long had the radio been there? 3 months before the date on the note meant it had been placed roughly 4 months into the endemic, which was the period when organized response was still theoretically possible before the infrastructure decisions became permanent, before people stopped waiting for an official signal and started building their own systems. Someone had been thinking clearly early and thinking specifically about forward communication. The frequency. Vera knew the band immediately. She'd worked adjacent frequencies in forestry operations. "It's not a civilian band," she said. "It's in a range that requires licensing and usually specific equipment. Whoever set this up was technical, or connected to someone technical. Same thing now." I spent an hour with the communicator's manual, which was in the case along with the unit. Hand crank, 7-band, capable of burst transmission in low power mode to reduce detection signature. Sophisticated. the kind of equipment that tells you more about its owner than most objects people leave behind. We agreed on a protocol. One transmission, brief, identifying our location in general terms and asking for acknowledgement. If no response in 48 hours, no second attempt. If response, we would evaluate what was said before deciding anything else. Vera said it this way: "We're not committing to anything by listening." That was true. I also knew, and I think she knew, that some information changes your options, whether you want it to or not. You can decide not to act on what you know, but you can't decide not to know it. The case was open. The frequency existed. Some threshold had already been crossed. We transmitted at 2200 hours. Station identification. Preserve grid reference only. Query. Acknowledgement requested. Frequency confirmed. 22 words. Vera read them in the flat professional cadence she used when she was being precise. We waited. Nothing that night. The dog slept by the station door. I slept in 4-hour segments, the way I'd trained myself to in the first months. Vera slept in what appeared to be a single, uninterrupted 8 hours, which she told me was not natural, but was the result of a discipline she'd developed after months of interrupted sleep had degraded her decision-making in ways she found unacceptable. She said this without any particular tone, as a statement of engineering rather than accomplishment. On the second morning, the dog was agitated. I noticed it before I'd fully processed the day's sequence. It was pacing the east side of the station with a tight, repetitive circuit that was different from its usual ranging behavior. Ears up, full attention northeast, the infected cluster. I went to the window with the monocular, the slough quadrant, and I saw what the dog had already calculated. The cluster had moved. Not drifted, moved with the kind of directional coherence that happens when infected acquire audio or visual lock. They were at the preserve's northeast boundary now, which put them inside the wire and 300 meters from the Marsh Trail junction. 4 of them, not 2. I had undercounted. That was a mistake I couldn't reverse, but I could manage its consequence. I woke Vera, and we spent the next 2 hours doing the specific quiet work of a station that needs to become invisible. Generator off. No movement outside. Wood duck calls in the marsh to monitor for disturbance. The cluster moved past the Marsh Trail junction. They didn't enter the trail. They continued northwest along the tree line in the stop-start stumbling movement of infected that are following an echo rather than a source. Gone from direct threat range in 40 minutes. At 1400 hours, the radio answered. A voice. Female, older, composed. Preserve grid received. This is Station Pelican. We hear you. Confirm. Is there a dog with you? I looked at Vera. Vera looked at me. We looked at the dog. Confirm, Vera said into the communicator. There is. A pause that lasted long enough to carry its own weight. Then you found what we left, the voice said. My name is Dr. Priya Subramaniam. I placed that case 14 months ago. I've been waiting for someone to activate that frequency ever since. Dr. Priya Subramaniam P. spoke for 40 minutes on that first contact. And I'm going to compress what she said because not all of it belongs to this story and some of it belongs to a larger one that I'm not qualified to tell. She was a wildlife epidemiologist. Had been contracted to the Hartwell Trust the year before the endemic, running a disease vector study on migratory birds and wetland contact zones. She knew the preserve. She had worked here. And she had been, for the 14 months since the endemic began, living and working from a converted research vessel anchored in a tidal creek system 22 miles south of the preserve. In a network of waterways that vehicles couldn't access and the infected couldn't navigate. She was not alone. There were, she said without elaboration, others. The radio in the marsh had been part of a deliberate search protocol. She had placed similar units at 3 other sites, all in wetland terrain, all in areas she knew would require a specific kind of person to reach them. Someone familiar with preserve geography, comfortable in wetland conditions, capable of reading the landscape at a level above the casual. She had anticipated it might take months. It had taken 14. "The dog," Vera said. "Tell us about the dog." A pause. "His name is Silt. I named him before I left the preserve. He was a research animal, not in any official sense. He followed me when I ran my field transects, and I let him. He's extraordinarily good at navigation in wetland terrain, and he has an accurate threat sense. When I had to leave, I couldn't take him on the boat. The ecosystem was too closed. I left him at the preserve, and I..." Another pause, and this one had texture in it. I told myself he would be fine, because telling myself anything else was not something I could afford. I looked at the dog. He was looking at me. 14 months. The dog had been alone at this preserve for 14 months, maintaining his association with a person who was gone, returning to the sites he associated with her, navigating the infected presence with a competence that I had attributed to instinct without considering that it might also be grief. "He found us," I said. "Both of us, separately." "I know," Dr. Subramaniam said. "I've been tracking your transmissions, or rather, I've been tracking Silt's behavior patterns. He has a radio collar that I placed before I left. Low-frequency position transponder, 6-month battery. It ran out 2 months ago. Until then, I knew where he was going." Vera set the communicator down gently and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then at the dog, then at me. "She built a search protocol around her dog's behavior," Vera said. "She knew what he would do, who he would find." "Yes." "That's either brilliant or insane." "It worked," I said. She picked the communicator back up. "Dr. Subramaniam, what do you need from us?" What Dr. Subramaniam needed was complicated. What she was offering in exchange was more complicated. The group on the vessel had developed, over 14 months, a specific capability, not military, not agricultural, not the usual categories of endemic era value. She was an epidemiologist, and she had continued doing epidemiology. She had been mapping the infected population patterns in the region's wetland and coastal corridor with the rigor and patience her training required. And she had found something that she did not want to transmit over radio. "I need to show you in person," she said. "And I need the preserve's data, your observation logs, anything you've recorded about the cluster behavior in your quadrant." 11 months of daily logs. I had them all. "How do we reach you?" Vera asked. "I'll send someone," Dr. Subramaniam said. "Someone who knows the water route. It will take them 2 days. Can you hold your position?" We looked at each other. We looked at the dog. "Yes," I said. 2 days felt like the right amount of time for anything that needed to change. I pulled every log I'd kept and spent the better part of an afternoon reorganizing them into a format that would make sense to a scientist, which meant translating my field shorthand, pulling the coordinates from the cluster sightings, building a rough timeline of infected drift patterns across the preserve. It was the kind of work that required enough concentration to keep me from thinking too carefully about what came next. Vera spent the 2 days walking the preserve. In a systematic pattern, she called a complete read every boundary, every trail junction, every established sightline. She drew a revised map on the back of a laminated park brochure with a fine-tip marker, marking what she called pressure points, locations where the geography would funnel infected movement, where defensive positions were viable, where they weren't. She worked fast and left nothing unmarked. She did it without being asked. That told me she was planning to still be useful in whatever came next. Which told me she'd already made a decision I hadn't consciously made yet. The dog, Silt, I started using the name the day after the radio contact, which felt inevitable. Rather than chosen, spent the 2 days running a pattern I hadn't seen from him before. Not the marsh trail, not the perimeter. He was moving between Vera and me in a circuit, checking on us with the quiet efficiency of something that has been given a responsibility it takes seriously. Every 3 or 4 hours, Silt at my left knee, then Silt at Vera's left knee, then away to wherever he went when he wasn't managing us. On the second evening, Vera found me at the station window watching the marsh go dark, and she stood next to me for a while before saying anything. "You're thinking about whether to go," she said. "I'm thinking about what going means." "Tell me the distinction." I considered it. Going is a choice about direction. What going means is a choice about whether direction still matters, whether I'm oriented toward anything. She didn't respond immediately. This was one of the things I'd learned about Vera in a short time. Her silences were never empty. They were the visible surface of a process running underneath. "I've been moving for 11 months, she said finally. "Root to root, cache to cache. I had a reason when I started, and then the reason was gone, and I kept moving, because stopping felt like admitting something." "What?" "That I didn't know where I was going." She said it with the same flat precision she brought to operational assessments, and it landed with exactly that weight. Silt wasn't lost. He was waiting. There's a difference I think I'd stopped knowing how to make. We stood at the window, and the marsh birds settled in the darkening reed beds, and the infected northeast were quiet for the first time in 3 days. "She found something," I said. "About Dr. Subramaniam. About what she wouldn't transmit over radio. The pattern data. What do you think it is?" Vera crossed her arms. "Something that changes the math. That's the only reason you don't say it over radio. Not because it's dangerous. Because once people know it, everything looks different." I thought about that for a long time after she went to sleep. The person doctor. Subramaniam's scent arrived on the morning of the second day at 6:50 through the eastern boundary fence. He was younger than I expected. Mid-20s, lean in the way of someone who had been very active for a very long time, with the kind of angular calm in his face that comes from having made peace with a level of physical risk that would unsettle most people. He introduced himself as Marcus before he'd fully cleared the fence. No last name offered, which seemed like policy rather than evasion. He had a small kayak stashed in the marsh corridor. He'd come in at first light, paddling the tidal creek network in segments, portaging at 2 points where the waterways narrowed below navigable width. He was precise and brief about the route, giving us what we needed to reverse it rather than more. He sat at the table with the same assessment energy Vera had brought on her first visit, and the two of them recognized each other's operational competence within about 4 minutes, which created a calibration I found useful. Marcus was from the vessel group. He'd been there since the beginning, he said. Since Dr. Subramaniam had started collecting people with specific skills and no good reason to be anywhere else. "How many people?" Vera asked. 9. We can support 12 comfortably, more with the right preparation." He looked at us in a way that was not indirect. Vera didn't look at me, and I didn't look at her. We were past the stage where we needed to look at each other to know where the other person was on something. "Tell us what she found," I said. Marcus had clearly been instructed to deliver this in person, and he did it with the careful structure of someone who had rehearsed the framing, not to manipulate. but because he understood that information with this kind of weight needed to be delivered in the right sequence, or it collapsed under its own implications. The infected in the region's wetland and coastal corridor were dying. Not from intervention, not from any external cause. From what Dr. Subramaniam's fieldwork had identified as a secondary systemic failure. The same biological process that drove the original infection had a progressive degradation cycle that, in wetland-exposed populations, was accelerating. Contact with specific waterborne compounds, she didn't give Marcus the technical specifics, which was deliberate, was disrupting the cellular persistence mechanism at a rate that varied by population density and water exposure frequency. The infected who drifted into wetland terrain were dying faster, much faster than the general population. And the implications of that, if it could be documented rigorously enough to be actionable, if the mechanism could be isolated, mapped, potentially replicated, were not small. That's why she needs the preserve data, Vera said. The preserve is at the intersection of 4 separate drainage systems, Marcus said. She has data from 2. You've been observing infected behavior here for 11 months. That's the 3rd system. She needs the 4th, which is the marsh corridor to the north. But your data gives her the baseline she needs to make the model work. I thought about 11 months of careful, private log entries, every infected sighting, every movement pattern, every change in cluster behavior, the kind of data you keep because you're a person who keeps data, without knowing what it's for. Silt walked to Marcus and sat at his feet. Marcus looked down at him, and something shifted briefly in his composed face. She's going to want to see him too, Marcus said. She asks about him every time we talk. I told Vera I needed the afternoon before we gave Marcus any answer. She said nothing. She gave me the afternoon. I walked the west perimeter alone, just me and Silt, the way it had been before Vera, before the radio, before any of this. Silt moved at my left flank with his usual precision, and I tried to think clearly about what was being asked. The station was safe. I had made it safe through 11 months of patient, systematic work. I knew its rhythms and its vulnerabilities, and I had reduced those vulnerabilities to a level I could manage. Leaving the station meant leaving that safety not forever, not permanently, but to travel 22 miles through a tidal corridor in a kayak with a man I'd known for 4 hours toward a group of people I'd never met, on the basis of a radio conversation and the navigational behavior of a dog. I knew what my pre-endemic self would have said about that risk calculus. He would have said it was unacceptable. But I kept thinking about what Vera had said. About moving for 11 months with a reason that was gone. About not knowing how to distinguish between waiting and being lost. And I kept thinking about Silt. He had been here alone for 14 months before I arrived, running his circuits, returning to the marsh point. He had not stopped. He had not given up on the possibility that the person who mattered to him was somewhere reachable. He had maintained the pattern of searching without any of the information that would have made that rational. He had kept going because stopping settling, accepting, closing would have meant the end of something he wasn't willing to end, and then he'd found us. Not perfect, not Priya, but people who could be led to the frequency, to the case, to the connection. He had performed the function he could perform in the situation he was actually in, rather than the one he'd been trained for. That felt like something. I am not a mystical person. I looked for the sample size. But some evidence arrives in forms that a log entry can't contain. I was at the marsh point by then. I'd arrived without intending to. which told me something about how the walk had been organized by my subconscious. The dead cypress, the standing water, the place where Silt had led us both, separately, until we were no longer separate. I stood there for a while. Silt sat. The moral weight of what I was considering was this. I had 11 months of data that was potentially significant to Dr. Subramaniam's work. Withholding that data, staying in my station, maintaining my perimeter was not an action without consequence. It was a choice with consequences that extended far beyond what I could see from here. The question was whether those consequences were mine to own. I had left Walterboro. I had made a decision in the dark there that I'd been living with since. I had told myself that the endemic was large enough that one person's withdrawal didn't matter at the scale of things. Silt had been alone for 14 months, and he'd still kept going back to the marsh point. I went back to the station and told Marcus we'd leave at first light. Vera accepted this without a sentence about it. She spent the evening compressing the station, not abandoning it, but rendering it dormant in a way that preserved its potential as a return point. She was systematic and without sentiment about it, moving through each room with the efficiency of someone who had packed and left before and knew which version of leaving was which. I spent the evening copying the log data. The original handwritten logs, yes, those went in a waterproof case that Marcus had brought for the purpose. But I also transcribed a summary document in the clearest notation I could manage, because I'd learned from Vera that important information should always have a redundant copy in a different format, stored separately. Silt moved between us all evening. At a certain point, he settled by the station door, not restless, not agitated, present, settled, in the way of an animal that knows where tomorrow begins and is ready for it. I sat with the empty log, the new one I hadn't started yet, and wrote one entry. Day 1. Previous station secured. Moving to new position by water route. 3 persons, 1 dog. Data transferred. Reason, sufficient. I didn't write more than that. I wasn't sure what else was true enough to record. Marcus had told us the water route would take 12 to 14 hours with 2 portages, paddling in 2 kayak relay with 1 person and Silt in each boat. He was matter-of-fact about the infected risk along the creek corridor, which was real but manageable. The tidal waterways were deep enough that infected couldn't ford them, and the banks were too unstable for them to approach without audio activation. We would be quiet. We would be fast. We would be fine, he said, in the tone of someone who meant it as a probability assessment rather than a reassurance. At 2200, I sat in the empty main room of the station and tried to account for everything I was leaving. The generator, the East Circuit snare lines, which would need to be reset by someone who didn't exist anymore, the water barrels, the precise knowledge of where every structural weakness was and how to navigate around it. I had built a life here that required exactly 1 person, me. I had built it that way deliberately, and now I was going to walk away from it. Not because it had failed, not because it had been threatened, but because I'd been shown something I couldn't unsee. There's a specific grief to leaving a place that was safe. Most people in the endemic leave places because they become unsafe. That's its own particular terror. But leaving somewhere that is working, that you made work, that requires a different kind of nerve. You're not running toward survival. You're running toward something less definable, which is harder. It requires you to believe, without evidence, that the thing you're going toward has the same quality of reality as the thing you built. I believed it. I put my log in my pack and went to sleep at 2300. The water route was everything Marcus had said, and one thing he hadn't. The kayaks were 12-foot sea-touring hulls that handled the tidal corridors cleanly, and Vera moved through the water with the same efficiency she brought to everything. low gunnel strokes that barely disturbed the surface. Silt rode in my kayak, settled in the bow between my knees, and watched the banks with the focused attention of a dog that knows its job. 6 hours into the journey, in a wide section of tidal marsh where the reed banks opened up, and the water went silver under noon light, we came across something Marcus had assessed as low probability, but not impossible. A single infected, mid-creek, standing chest deep in the tidal water. It had been there long enough that it was in the late stage of what I now understood from Dr. Subramaniam's preliminary findings, transmitted through Marcus the night before as wetland accelerated degradation. Its movement was minimal. Its threat radius was limited. But it was between us and the next turn in the corridor, and going around it meant a long detour through a section of the bank that Marcus's chart marked as unstable. We stopped paddling, floated, assessed. Silt was still, not the alert stillness of threat response, the patient stillness he held at the marsh point, observational, calibrated, waiting for the situation to develop. Vera, from her kayak, "We wait. It's not tracking us." "How long?" 10 minutes. If it hasn't fixed on us in 10 minutes, we paddle past on the far bank. Maximum distance, minimum stroke. It was the correct tactical call, and I knew it, and I held my paddle across my thighs and watched the infected, and thought about the fact that I had spent 11 months learning to move around things I couldn't fix, and that this was the first time I'd done it alongside other people, and that the difference in that experience was not what I'd expected. I had expected it to be harder, more contested. Instead, it was quieter. The presence of other competent people didn't add weight to the decision. It distributed it. 8 minutes. The infected's head turned south, away from us, drawn by something in the reed bank, a coot working the shallows, loud and oblivious. We went past on the far bank in 15 strokes. Silent. The infected didn't turn. The thing Marcus hadn't told us was the smell. 22 miles of tidal corridor in winter, with the particular organic compression that coastal wetland produces. It's a real and specific thing, layered and alive. And moving through it for 14 hours at water level is an immersive experience in a way that most of life post-endemic isn't. The endemic had flattened everything into utility. This was something else. This was the world being present in your nose and your lungs, whether you had time for it or not. Silt's ears moved continuously, cataloging. I found myself thinking about Priya Subramaniam, running field transects through a preserve that looked like this one, and a dog that followed her and kept following her line even after she was gone. 14 months of the same fidelity applied not to her presence, but to her absence. I didn't have a language for what that was. I had by then stopped needing one. We arrived at Station Pelican at 1900 hours. The research vessel was a converted 60-foot coastal survey boat, anchored in a tidal creek, elbow deep enough to prevent grounding at low tide, and obscured from the main waterway by a screen of mature cordgrass that had been shaped, I realized as we approached, by something more than accident. Someone had cultivated that screen, encouraged its growth, thought carefully about sight lines, and made the landscape cooperate. Epidemiologists thinking, you work with the environment's existing systems rather than against them. 9 people. Marcus made the introductions as we tied off the kayaks, names and functional roles, and I'm going to give you the ones that mattered to the next part. Raphael, a water systems engineer, 50-something and methodical. Kezia, who had been a paramedic and who moved through a crowded space with the particular alertness of someone trained to continuously triage. A pair of older women, sisters, who had run a small boat charter operation on the coast and who maintained the vessel with a practical expertise that was immediately visible in its condition. And Dr. Priya Subramaniam. She was smaller than I'd imagined from her voice. She came up from below deck, and the first thing she did was look for Silt. And Silt, who had moved through the entire journey with extraordinary composure, crossed the deck to her at a pace that was as close to running as his dignity allowed. And she knelt and put her face in his fur and stayed there for a long time. Nobody spoke. This was, I understood, a moment that the group had been waiting for, and they gave it the space that waiting earns. When she stood up, she looked at us, at Vera first, then at me with an expression I recognized but couldn't have named before the endemic. It was the expression of someone who has maintained a hope for so long and through so much that being shown its evidence produces not joy, but something more like structural relief. Like a weight-bearing part that has been under load finally receiving the support it was designed to need. "You followed him," she said. "He didn't give us many options," Vera said. "No," Priya said. And there was something in her voice that was dry and affectionate and precise in a way that told me exactly who she was. "He never does." She showed us the data that night. I'm not going to explain the science in detail because I understood only some of it, and this is not that kind of story. What I understood was this: the pattern was real. It was consistent across the data sets she had. And the addition of my preserve logs, 11 months of sighting data from the junction of 4 drainage systems, gave the model the geographic density it needed to move from significant observation to something publishable, something transmittable, something that, in the right hands, could become information that changed how people in the endemic were managing terrain and exposure. It wasn't a cure. She was very clear about that, in the way of a scientist who knows that the distance between mechanism and application is not a footnote. It wasn't even close to a cure. But it was something real, based in evidence, with implications that extended outward in directions she was still mapping. The last thing she said that night, sitting at the vessel's chart table with my logs spread before her and her reading glasses low on her nose. "He went to that spot because it's where I sat with him the last morning before I left. He remembered it precisely. Dogs have a spatial memory for emotional significance that we consistently underestimate." She looked over her reading glasses at Silt, asleep against my shin. "I left him there because I thought it was the only thing I could do. I was wrong. He found a better option. I have been on Station Pelican for 4 months now. I do not know what will happen with Priya's research. I know that it is being taken seriously because she takes it seriously in a way that leaves no room for it to be otherwise. I know that Marcus has made 3 relay runs to other contact points along the corridor, and that the data is moving in directions I cannot trace. I know that the preserve is still there. I checked its access road on our last northern run, and the station was intact, and the water barrels were still collecting rain, patient and purposeless, waiting for someone who might not come back. Vera is still here. She mapped the vessel's security gaps the first week, and Raphael used her map to modify 3 positions. And now she works the water route with Marcus when the conditions allow, which is most of the time, because she is very good in a kayak and she knows the corridor better than anyone, except Marcus now. Which took her 2 weeks. She doesn't talk much more than she used to, but she talks more than she used to, which is different. I have stopped keeping a daily log, not because nothing happens, but because what happens now belongs to more than one person. And a log that was designed for a single observer doesn't have the right structure for it. I keep notes instead. Observations. The kind that require context to mean anything. Silt sleeps between Priya and me most nights, though he still moves between people in his circuit pattern, still checks on each of us in his quiet, managerial way. He is unchanged by arrival. He was doing this before us, and he will do it after us. I think this patient, unglamorous fidelity to the people in his range. He does not appear to understand that he changed anything. He appears to understand only that there was a direction that mattered, and he kept going in it. I named him on the day we arrived at the vessel. Out loud, in front of everyone, looking at him directly. Silt. It's what Priya named him. It was never mine to change.